This is the Hammerli Model 100. It's a pistol I've shown off quite a bit in YouTube shorts, and it seems to have attracted a lot of viewership, so I thought I'd make a full review of it. And I've waited until now because I finally used it in a match, so not only will we go into the history and some of its mechanics, but I'll also talk about how it performed for me in a match. So this pistol is what's known as a free pistol, and it's designed specifically for the international sport of 50-meter pistol, which the sport itself is also referred to as free pistol. So what's so free about a free pistol? Well, in this context, free means more like open or unlimited. If you're familiar with other shooting sports, it essentially means there are little to no restrictions on what can be done to the pistol. And perhaps the most interesting aspect in regards to free pistol is not having a minimum trigger weight requirement. So a pretty standard feature of traditional target shooting sports is specifying some sort of minimum trigger weight for one reason or another. For example, in American Bullseye, you have a 4-pound minimum trigger weight for your service pistol. In Olympic Rapid Fire, you have a 1,000 gram or 2.2 pound minimum trigger weight, and so on. A heavier trigger will typically make it more difficult to extract precision out of a pistol for a number of reasons, and the opposite is also true. And that's why these free pistols are designed with trigger pulls usually under 50 grams. And that is extremely important in the context of this sport because, as its name would imply, you're shooting a pistol at 50 meters, and of course you're shooting it one-handed with iron sights. The current course of fire consists of 60 shots fired one at a time in 1 hour and 45 minutes, but here's where the extreme need for precision comes from. The scoring ring with the maximum shot value, the 10 ring, is only 50 millimeters across or about 2 inches in diameter. The 7 ring, which also encompasses the bullseye or the aiming black, is only 200 millimeters or about 8 inches across. There's also an inner 10 ring or an X ring, which is used for tie breaking while still being scored numerically as a 10. It's only about 25 millimeters or about 1 inch across. So you can see there's really not much margin for error in a sport like this, where at 50 meters you're trying to hit a target that's essentially 2 inches across. It's really a test of one's ability to hold the pistol steady and align the sights and let the shot fire without any additional influence on the pistol consistently and repeatedly over 60 shots. So that's kind of a brief overview of free pistols in general. Let's take a closer look at this particular pistol. It's a 22 long rifle, single shot pistol with a Martini action. Yes, the same Martini action on the famous Martini Henry rifle used by the British Empire for many years. It's just been shrunk down to a 22 long rifle, and really this whole pistol is built more like a rifle than your typical pistol. It has this beautiful octagonal barrel with a fully adjustable rear sight and a front sight that can be swapped quickly with a little detent. It has this beautiful anatomical wood grip that's a little bit too big for my hands, but it's still comfortable nonetheless. And it also has this matching forend that contains a recoil block directly attached to the barrel and helps provide some forward mass. Again, this is built more like a rifle than a pistol. You have 3 main points of interaction with this pistol. Of course, we have the trigger, but as it sits, the trigger won't do anything. In order to make this pistol ready to fire, we have to first open up the breech by pushing forward on this lever underneath the grip. It has a little latching mechanism that naturally unlocks when you push forward on it. We can then load a single cartridge of 22 long rifle into the chamber and then pull back on this lever until it snaps in place. At the same time, that'll close the breech. At this point, the pistol still will not fire, although the firing components are cocked and ready to go, and theoretically there's a round in the chamber. In order to activate or set the trigger, we then need to push down on this lever here on the side. Once it clicks, the trigger is ready to be pulled and the gun is ready to be shot. Of course, by separating the trigger from the firing components gives you a margin of safety, which is important with such a light trigger. As I've demonstrated in a few videos, this pistol can fire by simply jerking it around, so the trigger should really not be activated until you are absolutely ready and certain you're going to raise the pistol and fire. Right there, the pistol would have just fired. After the pistol was fired, you open up the breech just like before, and the extractor will kick the round out, at which point you can just dump the shell out by tipping the pistol on its side. Now, with how this pistol works and the trigger being separate from the firing components, this pistol actually lends itself very well to dry firing. If we open up the breech and set the trigger, we can dry fire this without inducing any wear on the firing components, and this is typically how I'll demonstrate the pistol. One other cool feature of this pistol's breech block is the groove down the center. Not only does this facilitate easier loading by kind of guiding the cartridge into the center of the breech area, but if you look under the rear sight, you can actually see a hole that allows you to easily clean this pistol from the breech end, so you can minimize the possibility of damaging the barrel's crown. So now let's take a closer look at just the trigger. At some point, I would like to show how this trigger works in detail, but I don't know how this gun comes apart and I'm not about to find out, but most set triggers work under the same principles. Instead of a normal trigger where you have a sear that releases a store of energy, which directly transfers that energy into a firing pin and thus the cartridge, a set trigger will usually have two sears and two stores of energy. The way this works is the set trigger sear will release one store of energy, which will then strike the real sear, which will then actually fire the cartridge. If you'd like a more detailed explanation of how this trigger works, I have a bonus video for channel members and Patreon supporters, but honestly, if you just read this paragraph in German, or if you look at the diagram long enough, you can probably figure it out. Now you can also see this pistol has a little screw going through the trigger. So normally when I see something like this, I assume it's an over travel screw. That's really not necessary with such a light trigger pull. And if you look, the screw isn't nearly long enough to hit the frame and limit over travel. What this is actually supposed to be what your finger touches when pulling the trigger. And by limiting the surface area down to either a screw head or reversing it so you get a sharp point that kind of pricks your finger, it allows you to feel the trigger better despite having such a low trigger weight. It's interesting to note that if you look at this screw, it actually has a slight angle off to the right, and it raises an interesting point about a concept in shooting that I guess you can call the straight back trigger pull. I'm sure at some point we've all heard about this, a concept that if we don't pull the trigger straight back, it will push the shot either left or right, depending on your handedness or how much trigger finger you have on the trigger. Well, in 50-meter pistol, you have very configurable pistols like this. And in the case of most free pistol champions out there, Olympic winners, world championship winners, they have their trigger shoes, or in this instance, trigger screws, actually set at a slight angle towards their dominant hand. This is the most precise shooting sport out there, and the top shooters for the most part don't care about a straight back trigger pull, and neither do I. Not with a free pistol, not with my air pistol, not with a double action revolver, not in the house, not with a mouse. The most important aspect of pulling a trigger is doing so in a way that doesn't disturb the sights, in a way that doesn't change anything about the way that you're holding the gun right at the instant of firing. And that can be accomplished, as can clearly be demonstrated by the sport of 50-meter pistol, without a straight back trigger pull. One last area to pay attention to on this trigger is the small screw behind the trigger. This actually allows you to adjust the engagement of the set trigger, which changes the trigger weight some, and also increases or decreases the actual trigger length, how far you have to pull the trigger back to get it to break. Clockwise will increase sear engagement, and counterclockwise will decrease it to a point in either direction. And there is a little hole in the trigger guard for you to fit a screwdriver through and adjust that. So this pistol is actually quite interesting from a historical aspect as well. Now, Hammerli as a company started off as a barrel maker in Switzerland in 1863, and eventually they made a name for themselves selling target arms until the original company was eventually closed down and the brand was sold sometime in the early 2000s, and before that it changed hands a few times. But this pistol in particular, to the best of my knowledge, came about in the mid to late 1940s, probably just after World War II, originally named the model MP33, and quickly started to dominate the sport of 50-meter free pistol. Okay, so now I feel like an idiot. When I got this pistol about a year ago, I remember it came with some paperwork. I don't remember it coming with a big packet of old American Rifleman articles and articles in German and stuff like that with a bunch of history on it. So I guess what I have so far in the video is going to be kind of an abridged history. I think at some point I may do like a full history video on this pistol because it is pretty interesting, just flipping through this and reading some of the articles. And annoyingly, I found out that the disassembly instructions that I ordered off of eBay for like 20 bucks are actually in here. You can actually head to the Wikipedia page on 50-meter pistol, and they have a list of Olympic and World Championship wins, as well as the model of pistol that was used to achieve those wins. And you can see from about 1947 to 1958, the Hammerli 100, also known as the MP33, won gold. A very closely related design, the Hammerli 101, won gold in 1964. If you're an American, you should also be proud that Hewlett-Benner, an esteemed bullseye champion, also brought home the gold in 1952 with this pistol. And as you can see, it's actually denoted on the models that were produced after that point. You can see it says Helsinki 1952. A gold medal was also won in London in 1948, and that was also denoted on the side of this pistol. Considering that gold was won again with this model in 1956, it's safe to assume that my particular example was probably manufactured sometime between 1952 and 1956, making it about 70 years old. The Hammerli 100's legacy does not stop in the 1960s with the Hammerli 101, 102, 103 series of pistols, as the pistol basically set the mold for all modern free pistols to follow. And the Soviets actually produced a very close copy that became incredibly popular, as it achieved largely the same performance at a significantly reduced cost. That model was, of course, the famous TAS 35, which was winning Olympic gold as late as 1996. Many records were set with that pistol, as well as the preceding Hammerli MP33 and 100 series of pistols. Today, the TAS 35 is still very popular for those who wish to shoot free pistol, and while it lacks some of the modern amenities you'll find on newer free pistols, or even some of the fit and finish of this nicer Hammerli pistol, it's still a very accurate and capable platform, and typically they're quite inexpensive. So I shot this particular pistol for the first time in a match, and I produced a score of 544 and 8 X's. Now this was shot on an American 50-yard range, and 50 meters being about 54 yards when converted to imperial, reduced size targets were used. The scoring rings on the reduced size B19 target are about 11% smaller than the full-size 50-meter target. So that means instead of the 10 ring being 2 inches or 50 millimeters, it's now 1.78 inches or 45 millimeters, and so on. So where does my score of 544 with 8 X's put me with this 70-plus-year-old pistol? Well, at the last Olympic Games where free pistol was shot, 2016 Rio, 544 with 8 X's would have been 29th out of 41 competitors. That year, a score of 567 was the highest of the qualification round, and a score of 556 was the lowest score that made it into the Olympic final. At the most recent World Championships, where 50-meter pistol is still shot as a non-Olympic sport, I would have come in 16th out of 30 competitors, so not quite 50th percentile. But hey, this is when I get my excuses in a row. The lighting conditions were pretty poor. It was overcast with a slight drizzle. To make matters worse, this sight setup really isn't to my liking. The front sight is very narrow. I typically like a front sight that's a little bit thicker than this, and I've talked about this in other videos. A thicker front sight, usually about 1/8 of an inch or 3.2 millimeters, is what I like because it's easier to keep sharp focus on. On guns I plan to shoot indoors, which usually have significantly worse lighting conditions than outdoors, I like my front sight to be even fatter still, and that's why my air pistol has a 1/4 inch front sight. This was also my first time ever shooting this pistol seriously. I hadn't even zeroed it prior to bringing it out to this match. That's where the 7 came from at 12 o'clock. That was my first shot in the sighting period, and as is typical of many European target pistols, when you get them, they come with a 6 o'clock or sub 6 o'clock hold from the previous owner. So I quickly zeroed that down to a center hold where I hold dead center, like the red-blooded American that I am, and within 3 zeroing shots, I was hitting the X-ring. For the rest of the match, I think I came down only 2 more clicks. And for the record, I have no clue how much these adjustments actually move the point of impact. If I were to shoot this pistol more seriously, I would probably figure that out pretty quickly. Now, I only had one 10-shot series where I shot a 7, and that was my lowest scoring series and the only series where I shot below 90. About halfway through the match, a bunch of people showed up to shoot the other international matches that were coming up after free pistol, and I got distracted by all the talking and commotion in the background. I think if that hadn't happened, I would have probably kept every series above 90. Also to note, since we were shooting on paper targets instead of electronic targets, we shot 10 shots, went down, scored, and repaired the targets, and then another 10 shots, and I think we had 17 minutes per series or something like that. Normally on electronic targets, you have one block of 1 hour and 45 minutes to shoot your 60 seconds, in addition to your sighting period. Other than that, I was very happy with the performance of this pistol using CCI standard velocity. The vast majority of my 60 shots were within about a 5.5 inch group in the center of the target. The only sticking point I had, quite literally, is that the chamber on this pistol is extremely tight, and I had to pretty forcibly press the CCI standard rounds into the chamber for the rim of the case to clear the breech block. Maybe if I were to shoot this pistol more, I would find a shorter overall length round that chambers easier. But beyond that, I had no other issues. CCI standard shot great, and I had no issues with light strikes, which is really the only failure that you can have with this type of pistol other than some kind of catastrophic mechanical failure. The one thing I will say, if you ever do decide to shoot this pistol or one like it, is that once that trigger is cocked, make absolutely certain that your finger is off the trigger when you raise the gun. It is extremely easy to touch one off before you're ready for it. And being a bullseye shooter and being used to 2 to 4 pound trigger pulls, my trigger finger is always on the trigger before raising. So I had to deliberately remind myself before every single shot to make sure my trigger finger was completely off the trigger before raising the pistol. And as I thought about firing the pistol, I brought my trigger finger in, it touched the trigger, and bang, the gun went off. So that's pretty much it for the Hammerli 100. I honestly picked this pistol up as a curiosity more than anything, but seeing how well I shot it, I have no doubt that I could probably produce some world-class scores with it if I had more time behind the gun. So in any case, thank you all for watching. Thank you especially to my channel members and Patreon supporters for supporting the channel directly. You can support me directly by clicking the relevant links in the description or on screen. Thanks again and have a great day.